Go? Yeah, okay. So this talk is about project planning. My name's Tim Mackinnon. I've worked for a number of companies. I originally worked at OTI where I did my Smalltalk, and lately I've been doing I work with teams doing Java, Agile stuff. Inevitably, I join them to do the cool stuff and find out there's problems with planning, and so I end up not doing refactoring and all kinds of cool things, but working with teams about planning. So I guess I should start off, and it's unusual to do this at the beginning of the talk, but I think I should start off by saying thank you, because the Smalltalk community really owes us a lot. I mean, a lot of things came from Smalltalk, be it virtual machines, be it refactoring, be it unit testing, and quite strangely, planning, the kind of planning I'm going to talk to you about, also came from Smalltalk. So I guess I sort of owe a big thank you. Ironically, the description of my talk is not in the conference notes, so sort of a bit of planning on my part, actually. Who knows Microsoft Project? So I thought maybe that what I should do is come up with a little tutorial here on Microsoft Project. No, actually, I'm just kidding. That's exactly what I'm not going to do. So yeah, no Microsoft Project is sort of the point of this talk. So I got into this planning thing, and I first heard about Agile. I was working with a team, and what happened was we were all brought into a room. We were sort of going to bid for some big project, and this guy sat down with a spreadsheet, and he said to us, he said, "Right, how long is it going to take you to do this piece?" And someone knew what it would take. They said, "Oh, it's going to take a week." So the guy nodded his head and said, "Yep, okay, that's good." And then he said, "Right, what else do we need?" And someone put up their hand and said, "Well, we need to do this other piece." And he said, "How long is that going to take?" And someone said, "Oh, that's about half a day." And then there was another piece, and that was going to take 2 hours. And there was another piece, and that one was 3 weeks. And as time went on, I sort of noticed that what this guy was doing was typing it into a spreadsheet. And what really upset me was the idea that you can take really tiny things and add them to sort of bigger things and add them to bigger things, and a number comes out at the end of it. And I think that's really, really scary because, I mean, you can just imagine what that schedule is going to be like. I mean, it's just full of crap, right? And so that is kind of the premise of this talk, is to not end up in that position. I know I started asking all kinds of questions in that meeting, and I was kicked under the table and told to shut up so that we could just get the hell out of there. Because, I don't know about you guys, but sitting in a room trying to do planning is absolutely horrendous. I mean, it's maybe a necessary evil, but, I see a lot of, technical faces out there, and I think you probably all hate planning. Put your hands up if you hate planning. Yeah, that's like most of the audience, right? And, obviously these numbers get put into Microsoft Project, and we're back to the same problem again, right? So it was interesting, a couple of weeks ago I happened to read the Coding Horror blog, and they kind of pointed out an article by Tom DeMarco, and he said he was coming to the conclusion that software engineering is a time whose ideas kind of come and gone. I thought, oh, that's interesting. And what he was actually saying is that software construction its conception is experimental, and I guess what he's getting at is, if you go and read the article, you can read it in the July-August, I think it was the IEEE article. What he's getting at is it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. And as you read through, he's kind of hinting at sort of agile software techniques. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those in a few slides on. So, the Agile Approach. What's it all about? Well, once upon a time, there was these guys, Ken Schwaber, there's Kent back there, he's the Smalltalk guy. I'm not very good at Photoshop, so I didn't do a very good job of kind of whacking him in there. Anyway, these guys, what they found interesting was that they came up with a way of running teams and developing software that was very incremental, and they couldn't really agree on a name of it. I mean, there was all kinds of discussions about it. And so what happened was, they kind of watered it all down and came up with this idea called Agile. And it's an umbrella term, and so Scrum fits in it, which is Ken Schwaber's thing, and there's extreme programming, which is kind of the Smalltalk-inspired thing that Kent Beck came up with. And the problem is that The really popular one is Scrum. And yeah, I'm Scrum certified, but there's a really good article by Martin Fowler, and it's called Flaccid Scrum. And the problem is, it's not very disciplined, right? It's like, it takes out all these kind of management things. I mean, I'm not saying it's terrible, but there's not a lot of technical meat underneath it. And with that means that you get burned down charts and they just kind of burn out into infinity, and the teams aren't really kind of taking control of what they need to do. And that really concerns me. And, you know, I think talking to a Smalltalk crowd here, you know, there was a lot about extreme programming that was really good. And I'm not going to talk all about extreme programming. I'm going to talk about just specifically the planning side of it. But the good news is that, you know, Smalltalkers, we do a lot of what extreme programming was about. I mean, there's a few other things that you might want to consider. And, you know, talk to me afterwards and I can talk about those. But the idea behind extreme programming was turning the dials to 11. You know, if testing is good, do testing to the max, right? 11. You know, same thing with planning, same thing with refactoring, same thing with all kinds of things, right? Simplicity as well. And I guess what we're getting at is this comparison of approaches. Like, sort of this waterfall idea was, you know, you spend 3 or 4 months doing analysis, and then you spend 3 or 4 months doing design, and then you get into the implementation, and probably, although this testing one is planned to be that big, it probably gets crunched down to like some little teeny little spot, because everything overruns and everything doesn't make sense anymore anyway. And, you know, 3 years go by and nothing is delivered. So then there was this idea about iterative. So the idea was, well, why not just squash the waterfall down, right? So just kind of make it a little bit smaller. And so maybe we'll spend a month of analysis, a month of design, and we'll do those quite rapidly. A little bit better, but again, it did sort of suffer from the idea that there's a lot of planning going on up front, and it doesn't necessarily match reality when, you know, as coders, when we often get the designs, it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. You know, and as you start building things, that doesn't even make any more sense, and then all of a sudden your schedule goes to hell. So the Agile idea was to do like little teeny-weeny bits of analysis, design, notice how they do a little bit of testing and then implementation, and sort of kind of really spiral around and do those very quickly. And I think actually it's kind of, you know, pretty popular now. It's quite a well-known thing. So I think, you know, a lot of people are doing this. If you're working in a bigger organization, like if you're in a startup, you can probably just keep doing that all the way along. If you're working in a bigger organization, you need to get a bit of budget and this kind of thing. So often you will do a little bit of upfront analysis to kind of scope the size of something to get your budget, but then you very quickly want to get into these very tight iterations of analysis, design, testing, and implementation. You know, I guess I'm saying this to a crowd that really is aware of this, but the idea of simple design is actually very, very important. I mean, a lot of these big upfront design things were based on the idea that as time goes on, it becomes exponentially expensive to make a change. And if that is kind of the reality, you're gonna plan as much up front, so you are not the guy that, you know, 3 months, you know, you spotted some problem here where it might have cost, you know, £1,000 to fix, and then 3 months later it's going to cost, you know, £10,000 to fix or something like that. So faced with that kind of situation, you know, you do a lot of planning up front. The problem is planning isn't a cheap thing, right? You've got a lot of people working things out, and often like things are created, artifacts are created that aren't even needed, so it's actually not cheap. But what the Agile folks talk about is flattening that cost curve. And this is why it's very important to refactor your code, to throw away things that you aren't using, to have suites of automated tests so you've got an automated build, because what you're doing is you're keeping that cost curve down so you can defer decisions. So, you know, if you spot something here, it's going to cost just as much to do it here as it is to here. More or less. I mean, it possibly wavers up and down a little bit, but the idea is to keep that cost curve flat. You know, and really talk about you aren't going to need it. I mean, it's really quite nice to hear the Seaside guys talk about what they've thrown out of the framework, right? They're always throwing things out and getting rid of them so that they can move along faster, right? So, what does this all have to do with planning? So there's a lot of kind of practices that kind of sit around here, this paired programming, refactoring, simple design, and there's this planning up in the corner. And incremental planning is supported by a lot of these practices. So when you do these very tight iterations of plans that I'm going to talk about, they should be backed by a number of these ideas, which I'm not going to talk about at the moment, but you know, you can take away what I'm going to mention now. But you may want to consider some of these other things like automated unit tests and, you know, refactoring and, you know, retrospectives, these kinds of things. So what does the life cycle of an Agile project look like, and where does the planning fit in? Well, there's a bit of upfront planning that I talked about with that little red. I sort of talked about that, sort of those little bits here. There's a little bit of upfront planning. And then you very quickly get into these iterations where write some tests, write some code, integrate it, QA it, deploy it, figure out what you're going to do the next iteration. So there's a little bit of planning there, go round again, and then keep going round and round and round. So you're kind of like following these little bits. And the idea is to keep delivering something, working code, production code that you can ship. And a lot of teams do actually successfully achieve this, but you really need to be able to press the button and boom, it comes out. And what are you promising your customers? What kinds of things is your team capable of doing? And that's kind of where the planning angle comes in. So how do you plan then? Well, what you're going to need is you're going to need a backlog of stories. You're going to need some requirements. You're going to need something to kind of, some artifacts that, what is it that you're trying to build? And here's a picture of a team that's kind of surrounded by these little pink requirements here. And they're kind of deciphering what it is that they need to do. And I want to talk a little bit about that because it is kind of the basis behind some of the later pieces that I'm going to talk about. So, depending on the size of your project or the size of your company, you might need to spend anywhere from 1 to 5 days kind of doing some workshops, coming up with the requirements. I think most teams do this actually. I'm sure that the Syncom guys or the Gemstone guys probably sit in some room with a whiteboard and kind of work out all the pieces that they need. And so what you're doing is, I like to call it forecasting, sort of like weather forecasting, because it's not an exact science, right? It's like you kind of know in the summer it's going to be a particular temperature, but you don't know if it's going to be like a red hot summer, or if it's going to be an English summer where it just pours all 3 months. So when you've done that little bit of forecasting, then you can start talking about these iterations of work. So forecasting, like I said, real users, product owners, team members. You might have some existing systems that you're going to work from. You might have some workshops if it's something new. I kind of like this idea. These are sort of the Steven Spielberg diagrams where he sort of like cartooned the film. I think this is Raiders of the Lost Ark. So he kind of cartooned the film of what he was building. Well, a lot of what you're doing in the early stages of a project is sort of cartooning. It's very kind of lo-fi. It might have been some paper prototypes, like that kind of stuff. You might have some diagrams that you're kind of building up and sort of understanding what it is that you need to do. But this is at a very high level at the moment. And like I said, that can take anywhere from if you're a small team, it can be 1 or 2 days. Sometimes if you're a big team or you're just starting it, you get some consultants in and they might do workshops for 2 weeks with you. And it all kind of depends on the scale. But you just want to get, effectively, you want to get something like these sorts of flip charts, right? Where it's a little bit dark, unfortunately, but basically they're saying, create a debtors record or something, and I want to locate debtors, and there's a bit of background here, up to 10 calls per day, and there's a few kind of screen mock-ups. So you can kind of like think about this big flip chart on the wall, right? And then you'll probably end up with a wall full of about 10 or 15 flip charts of like big chunky requirements, like the kind of thing that you want to do, right? And you really should have the whole team there. It's like, it's not just the customers. You want people in the development team there because they can help draw some of these screens. They can help inject some of the ideas. They get a feel for like what the project is actually all about. So what those tend to be called, there's a bit of terminology, and I think this is actually borrowed from Scrum actually. They call those epics, so like kind of big stories. Probably too big for you to actually work on or put an estimate on, right? And in the technical sense, what we really like is like little small pieces, something that you could be given, or a team could kind of look at and say, well, I know how to do that, and put an estimate on it, right? So there's this kind of mapping of how to get from epics down to stories. And I keep sort of mentioning these stories. I call it story card technology. And it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing, right? Because I'm really talking about these little paper index cards that you've kind of seen the pictures on the slides. Those index cards actually make really good tokens for planning. They're tangible. You can kind of stack them on a table. You can arrange them on a table. You can like pin them on the walls, and you can work against these sorts of things. So what you really want to do is take one of those big epics, one of those big flip charts, and you want to start breaking it down into like much smaller things. And I find that the best way to do this is you want a good title on a card. You want some sort of narrative of the requirement, right? And sometimes people talk about the as a call center employee, I want to enter a person's details so that I can later look them up for their billing information or something like that. So there's a little bit about sort of what it is that you want. There's a little bit about how you would know if the story was complete. Put a date on it, and maybe there's an author behind it, right? So that kind of level, what you could fit on an index card. Now, it's not the full requirement. This is a token for a future conversation, right? So it's like, I could give you one of those cards, and you might be able to put an estimate on it, but at some point you might have to go and ask someone, like, what do you want the screen to look like? Or, it may well be that some of that is captured on the card, but often or not, there's a little bit of ambiguity there. And so you should think about it as just-in-time requirements, right? So it's like, we put a little bit of effort into taking this epic, splitting it up into smaller pieces, but, we might never use some of those pieces. So I don't want to invest a lot of time, writing lots of acceptance tests for it, where it might just be an idea that just kind of goes away, right? But, it should have enough information that you possibly, as a team, could estimate it in some manner. And I'm going to talk about estimation in a minute. So here's a kind of an example of a story card. You can actually, there are tools that will let you type these things in, but I would really suggest that you actually print it out on a real card. So here is like actually a real story card. It was printed out using a tool, and I can show you a tool that I wrote in Smalltalk, but you really can just use a pen and an index card and just write on the index card, because invariably it gets scratched out and people make, these are the just-in-time requirement signs of things. You're sitting with someone, you're saying, oh yeah, what does this mean? And they're saying, well actually, I didn't mean that it had to, what it is here, use the last good feed within 24 hours. They said, oh, actually, you can just show us an error. We don't really need to go back and get another good feed. Just throw an error, and that'll be good enough. So that kind of got scribbled out and changed, right? So I'm going to talk to you. There's, how many people do Agile development here? There's a few hands here. So you might recognize this term. So often what gets talked about is this concept of velocity. It's like, oh, how fast are you going, right? How's your velocity on your team, right? And the problem with that is, it's an unfortunate name, because velocity sort of indicates speed, and it's really got nothing to do with speed. At the time when the XP folks were having their conversations, they used to have this term called load factor. So they sort of had this idea that for every story, they would kind of work out a load factor. It's like you said it was one number, but it might take 5 times as long to actually implement. And so there was this load factor of 5. And you could use that number to kind of do some projection. But it all got very, very complicated, and people never understood it. So they replaced it with this term called velocity. And it was supposed to be a simplification. And really what it's about is range. It's how far can your team go in an iteration. How much work can you get done in that iteration? And I like this kind of metaphor of a hill. If you're going uphill, your car might get 30 miles to the gallon, but if it's an uphill ride, it might be a little bit less. It might be a bit more like 20 miles to the gallon, right? But if you come over the other end, you might get 45 miles to the gallon, right? So it's this kind of idea of range. So it will fluctuate and vary, but it's how far can you go? So to kind of understand this range, you need to know a little bit about estimation. You need some unit. I've said miles per gallon for the cars. Well, what is this? What are you measuring these little story cards in for your team? And so some consultants will come and they'll give you these planning poker cards, this sort of point system. And so what happens is, you get one of these little story cards and they'll sort of say, how long will you take? How long will this take? And everyone's got a deck of these cards, and like one guy might hold up a 5 and someone might hold up a 2. And if the numbers are different, they have this conversation about, okay, well, why are you saying 5? Why are you saying 2? And then you might sort of agree that actually it's a 5 or something like that. And it's just some abstract number system, and you kind of write that number on each of the cards, right? So you just kind of go through this kind of process. To be honest, I think it's a bit of a scam, actually, myself, but they'll give you their little cards with their logo on it, and to be honest, I think you could do quite well with just your fingers. And if you want to kind of have a logo, you can write something on your hand, right? Everyone on the team can write something on their hand. But the idea is, right, you can do this. You can do this same thing. If I've got one of these, these story cards that, you're sort of saying, okay, well, that call center story, how long is it going to take? Well, everyone on the team can kind of like hold up 2 fingers or 1 finger. And I just sort of say estimate in ideal days because, I don't know, I find most people kind of think in time. And, you know, it's maybe a kind of skewed vision of time, but we're pretty much time-based. And so I think there's no problem with just sort of saying, okay, well, I think that'll take a day. And someone else says, I think it'll take 2 days. And someone else says, I think it'll take 5 days. Right? And then the idea is that in your group, you can say, well, if you say 5 and you say 1, what's the difference? Why, you know, why are you saying that? You have a little bit of a conversation. You might agree that, oh, yeah, I'd forgotten about the database migration. Geez, yeah, it's going to be a lot higher, so maybe it's a 3, and you agree on some number, right? So that's kind of a nice little trick. That's called planning poker. So that's kind of a nice little trick for lightweight estimating. And so you can sit in a group and you can quite quickly go through these cards that I've talked about. And so how does this velocity thing work? So I talked about this miles per gallon idea. So if I've got a story and you know we sit around and you know maybe we come up we kind of agree that this is a 2. Okay, so sorry, let me back up again. If we're working on a project and we finish a story that had an estimate of 2 and we finish it, our velocity would actually be 2. If we keep working, say, you know, it's the beginning of the week, on Monday we finish one story that had this value of 2. Our velocity is currently 2. That's kind of how far we've gone. Maybe on Tuesday we managed to finish another story, and it was a 1. Can anyone guess what our velocity is now? 3, exactly. So our velocity is now 3. Another story comes along, so we're getting along to like Thursday or something like this, and that card had a 3 on it, right? You can guess the velocity is now 6. So velocity is a measure of how many of these cards you finished in a time period. So often, you know, people will talk about a week's iteration or a 2-week iteration. You can even apply it to a Scrum sprint. The idea is that at the end of that time period, that week, you just count up all the numbers that you wrote down on each one of those cards, and that is your current velocity. That is an interesting number that I'm going to talk about in a minute, right? Because we can use that. So given this budget, so like if last week I had this velocity of 6, you would use that number the following week to sort of say to your customers, well actually, okay, so you got all these stories, how many are we going to do? Well, probably the best strategy to take is if we finished 6 units of work last week, we should promise to do 6 units of work this week. And that's got a nice sort of symmetry of it. So here's a picture here where there's these cards, and can you see that little hole there? That was the limit. You know, I don't know what their velocity was, maybe it was 10 or something, right? So these cards all added up to, probably with that card in there, is probably 15. And so these customers were told, you can't have that much, right? You've got to take something out. And so what they're trying to do is pick something else so that it all adds up to 10, which is your velocity. And that's why the XP guys called it a planning game. It wasn't so much that it was kind of fun or trivial. It was the idea that it's a game to try and get everything to add up to the velocity. So, you know, you might pick 3 big stories and 1 small story, or you might pick you know, 7 little small stories and get it all to add up to that velocity. And the nice thing about that is it makes people make decisions, right? It really forces them to prioritize what it is that they want. And it's honest, right? Because if you only finish 5 units the next week, well then your velocity is now 5. And you shouldn't be promising to do 10 units of work. You should be clean and honest and say, I can only do 5 units of work, so let's pick the top 5, you know, the things that add up to 5 that are the most important for you that you would like to see next week. I think this idea is just the same sort of thing, right? So it's like, with that planning idea, so, you know, you've got your things up. Customers picked a card for 3, velocity was 7, you know, that all adds up to 8. That's a problem, right? You've gone over your velocity. So if you pick a 2, cool, you're at 7, you can go on. And it's a nice way of working with customers and being open and transparent. And it's really that simple, right? That's the whole kind of concept of velocity, which is what drives this kind of thing. Scrum takes these numbers and does something called a burn-down diagram. So basically you start off with like all this amount of work, and what you want to do is see work get down, you know, kind of work completed. As you finish each of these cards and you kind of counted your velocity, you'll get down to 0, which is a very scientific way of thinking about it. And I've often found when working with customers, they don't really understand this burn down. To be honest, most team members don't understand burn downs, to be honest. I think it's much easier to think about Burnup, because it kind of looks like a profit diagram, right? It's like, oh yeah, I want to make £100,000. So, you know, the green in this diagram is what is your current velocity. I managed to finish 3 things on Tuesday, you know, some more on Wednesday. So basically, you kind of want to see things being finished. What you don't want to see is scope creep. So if you start kind of adding more stuff that goes over your target, that's a bad idea, right? That's kind of like, you know, there's no way in hell that you should be adding things in here because you didn't even make it right there, right? The yellow is kind of work in progress in this diagram. So it's like, okay, so they finished one thing, they're working on something else. So what you don't want to see is lots of work in progress, very little things finished. You don't want to see lots of work in progress. Blue is like sort of the things that you've yet to start. You don't want to see that thing, you know, people are jamming in more stories in the back. You're only finishing a little things off. That's very unrealistic. So, what about tracking progress? So we're starting to get into some sort of project management-y things, right? So I've done a lot of experiments with this, and so inevitably people end up kind of pinning these cards on a board and sort of, I think initially we started out with like little coloured dots to kind of indicate what was finished. It's pretty good, you can stand around that and you can sort of see what you're working on, but it's not too obvious actually what's going on. So we kind of made some improvements and we kind of morphed it into something like this, right? And so the idea was that these were kind of uncompleted stories. These were stories that had just started in this column. These were ones that were half done. These are ones that are almost done, and then these are ones that are completed. The other thing that was really nice that some friends sort of pointed out to me is if each team member has got like a little avatar, so I think these are kind of like South Park avatars, little magnetic avatars, people actually stick an avatar. I'm working on this story and I'm half done. And that actually has quite a profound impact, right? Because what you're getting people to do is stand around the board, and this is called the stand-up meeting. So every day, typically, people will stand around some sort of board, and these are the cards that you picked that kind of met the velocity that you've measured. You're asking people to say, well, I worked on that story and I'm half done. And, you know, I worked on this story and I've actually completed it. You know, so that's a bit of green, so that's like, great. If everyone's standing around sort of saying, well, you know, I worked on something and it's really not moved anywhere, that's a really bad sign. And you get a really nice effect when people do that, because if every morning I got to stand up and explain, you know, the story that I'm working on, why it hasn't moved, that's very good. And the nice thing about this is it actually translates quite nicely to these kinds of burn-up diagrams, right? So like things that are sort of just started, almost done, that's this yellow bit here, right? Things that are actually completed, that's this green bit. So you can actually kind of plot these very easily on a graph. This is some software that's doing this, right? But you can do it very easily just with a whiteboard. And when you start doing this, you start getting some measures. So, question for you. So how is this team doing? Yeah, a lot of work in progress. They haven't got much finished, right? Yeah. What about this one? Would you say that was that a good iteration? I mean, it's good that they finished a lot of stuff, but it seems a bit kind of weird that there was kind of nothing going on and all got finished on the last day, right? Either people aren't reporting or they're kind of not giving honest answers, right? So I would be sort of a little worried about that. How about this one? Yeah, I mean, that's better. I mean, it'd be nice if you could kind of finish that last bit. You can sort of see that, you know, the ideal iteration is green, right at the very top, right? It just kind of, it's very difficult to perfectly get it. How about that? I mean, that's much better, isn't it? I mean, that one kind of really kind of went well. And this is a real team, by the way, so you can see what happened. You know, you get very confident. Oh yeah, we're doing really well, and then boom, it all goes to probably, you know, and then what happened was they pulled up their socks and said, right, we're really going to kick ass. And so this time you could see that about here they started adding scope because they could see that they were going to make it. Right? It was like, hey, Mr. Customer, you got any more stories that we could put in? And put a few more in, and I mean that's a great iteration. And you know, how's this team doing? So basically this is kind of, each day you can do this kind of diagram. So, you know, on a Wednesday, how's it looking is basically what I would be saying. So it's not looking too bad. I'm a little bit worried that the greens, you know, we haven't had a step up, but you know, we've got some work in progress. I guess we'd have to sort of be careful, right? You know, you don't want it to kind of keep curving over like that. And like I said, you could do this on just a whiteboard and just, it's actually quite a good exercise to get team members to stand up and like plot that little diagram and understand where you are, right? If you're down here, you've got lots of green or no green, you're down here, it's kind of rainy. If you're doing well, then it's sunny. So that was something that I saw a team do. You can also do this across many so I've been just talking like very locally about just little small iterations. But a lot of projects, it's like, okay, we've got a goal in mind. We have these like big 5 epic stories. That's the system that we're going to deliver. We've taken those stories, we've split them down, so maybe we've got like, 75 little cards, like little requirements that we're needing to finish. Those 75 requirements, you can sort of stick down there and sort of say, well, hopefully, if you've got a little bit of data, this is easier. If you know the velocity that you've been working at, so you might have to work a couple of weeks to get that number. You can then project it forward and sort of say, okay, well, if I can do 10 units of work a week, and I've got 150 cards, I've got cards that add up to 150, divide by 10, 15 weeks, right? So you can like plot 15 weeks, and then you can start taking the results of each one of those little iterations that I showed you, and you can graph it, and you can see how you're doing. So this team, well, good there, bad, not so good there, but that looks, that looks hopeful. I mean, that looks realistic, right? And I think this is the thing that, Tom DeMarco was talking about. It's not cast in science. You got to work with it. You got to work with your team a little bit. And, you can get software that does this kind of thing. So again, you can sort of see this idea of projection. Now, I did a little bit of work with these epic stories. It could be a lot of work to kind of break them down to get your 150 cards, or your 75 cards, right? So I did a little bit of work about taking the high-level stories and sitting a team down and sort of saying to people, okay, well, I want you to give me your best estimate on an epic level. And so you could estimate, well, I didn't say what unit, right? But I think invariably people estimate it in weeks. And so you can kind of sit down and kind of come up with numbers for those top-level stories, and you can graph in that level. So you can sort of say, okay, well, this management reporting epic, I think that's going to take 3 weeks. And this other one, the actual database persistence or something like that, I think that's going to take 2 weeks. So you can do that kind of estimation. I've gone off that idea, actually, because I think that you should really be able to sit down, take one of these top-level stories, and if you think about like an outliner, you should be very quickly able to break things down quite quickly, just sort of outline it. And I've got a little bit of software that does do that, but in the interest of time, I think I've got about 5 minutes left. I won't show you that. But the idea is like, you can do it with a piece of paper as well, right? Management reports. Okay, well, what reports have we got? If you've got 10 reports, boom, there's a card for each single report. If a report you think, well, that one's a little bit complicated, if you think about how to describe it, maybe just with the title even of each story card, just writing the titles down, you can very quickly break down epics into manageable pieces. And so then, so then you can kind of graph it this way, where this is just, okay, just take the real, this is just like all 150 stories, and this is just the ones that you completed in each of the iterations.
So once you know enough about the structure of the system, you can break down the epics, then you can see how to do it.
Yeah.
Right at the beginning, when you have no idea how to do it, it's going to be really hard to break it down.
In technical terms, maybe, but you should be able to break the problem down into bits that you can describe. If you can't break it down, then you need to do more workshops. So that little bit at the front where I said, the forecasting, if you can't break it down, then you need to spend a little bit more time, and maybe you need to like prototype or do some kind of a bit of coding with the team to get an understanding of this is where we're going to go. And you don't need to solve every single problem. You just need to be able to sort of understand that when this story card is talked about, it has something to do with that particular report. And I've talked to someone, I've seen what the report looks like, or I can imagine what it is, right? So that's the kind of idea that you go for. So this works really well, and I work all the time with teams, and once I get to that point of sort of this kind of level of planning, we've done some epics, we've broken things down, we've got lots of story cards. It's not to say that you can't add and remove story cards, so you can like kind of you can keep plotting this, and it might go up and down as you discover more, and you're just being honest with your customers about, look, this is the velocity that we've got, this is the rate that we can do things, you can start prioritizing things and making hard decisions about what you're going to deliver. And the idea is to, like, these little things, you actually finish them off so they're production quality to actually go out the door. However, there's another thing that's kind of very popular and in vogue at the moment, and it's called Kanban. And the idea behind Kanban is like, okay, let's do no estimation at all, which is pretty scary actually, but there's an interesting idea here. So first of all, it's probably worth me sort of saying a little bit about Kanban. And I'll put my hand up and say that I've not worked on a team using Kanban. I've kind of looked at the ideas. It seems interesting. And you can read a little bit about it on the web. But the basic idea is apparently some Japanese gardens, they came up with a system where there was only so many visitors that could actually go into the garden. So what they did is they created a bunch of cards, like little red plastic cards. And they had 50 of them, or some number. And what they did was, as people went into the park, they gave them a red card. When you ran out of cards, you queued. So you queued and you waited. When people left the gardens, they took the red card, and the little guy kind of ran round to the front door and gave the card to the next person, right? And that's called the Kanban system, this idea of kind of limiting flow. It comes from lean manufacturing, and there's some great lean manufacturing books. So the idea behind Kanban planning is basically to have these little stories. You probably follow the same sort of techniques I've talked about with epics and breaking things down into stories. But the idea is to sort of set some cues. And the project is kind of divided up a little bit different from what I described. If you remember what I described when I showed a board, it was just sort of stories, and then it was kind of just started, half done, almost complete. Those words, by the way, were actually picked because trying to get someone to tell you how well they've done on a story is very difficult. When someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "Is it almost done yet?" What do you answer? I mean, it's very difficult. I found it was easy for people to just sort of say, "Oh, I've just started it. I'm about halfway." I mean, really, what we're interested in is it actually complete. It's passed all its tests. It's done. This is kind of divided in a different way. It's sort of divided into. They've got sort of creating acceptance tests, development tests, deployment. Sometimes there's QA. It's kind of a little bit more siloed in its structure. And that kind of mimics some of the early work done with Kanban was on going to teams that were a little bit screwed up. And so it's like, okay, we'll tell you what we'll do is, the QA people are totally overloaded. So we'll stick a queue up in there of like 3, right? So they can have 3 cards on the go at once. Once there's 3 cards going, things stop. Right? And when the kind of the flow stops, when the team says, "Oh, I want to put more things into QA, but I can't because they've already got 3 QA things on the go," then the team has to sort of decide what to do, right? It could mean that we haven't got enough testers, so it's not worth developing more code. We should stick more developers over to help the testers to kind of clear the backlog, so that now we've got a free slot. So there's 3, so we've got a free slot, so we can now take something that's ready and move it into the next section. And so as things kind of work their way through the system and they're done, you free up a space over here. So this has got like a limit of 5. So when one of these things goes, one of the stories in the background, you can now go to your customers and say, right, we've got a space free. What do you want to go into there next? So it's a little bit more kind of flow-based. I have a few concerns about the siloing of things. I think sometimes having teams that, it's very easy to throw things over the wall and say, right, you test it. On XP teams, they tend to have very kind of flat roles. It's like you both test, you refactor, you do some analysis. Everyone does a little bit of everything. You might have specialists that will kind of help people along, but invariably it's very kind of we do everything. In this one, it's a little bit more siloed, and so that's kind of one sort of thing that I think is a little bit tricky. But I'm sure there's ways around it if you want to try it. I don't remember what the other thing was. Oh yes, the other important thing is because there's no planning, it's just kind of a flow-based thing. I'm a little bit concerned about what causes stories to be split. So one of the things I didn't mention was in the planning game. Oh, a couple of minutes back, Jen. In the planning game, if you hit you want to put a card in, it's too big. You say to your customer, "Oh, I can't accept that one." Sometimes people might say, "Well, you know what? We could split that card in half. Maybe you don't need something quite that complicated." And so that drives the conversation around how to split things up, or how to maybe we could take this card out because I could see how that one's more important and it would help. that would be missing here. So you would need some sort of force that sort of says, you know, what is the gain that you've got that sort of drives you to make prioritization decisions, right? And so that's what you would need for Kanban. It's interesting though, and you know, I encourage you to work up about it. Oh, and the measurement that you use is cycle time. So rather than velocity, what you use is cycle time. So you write down when a card enters the system, you write the date on. When it comes out, you record the date. Maybe it took 2 weeks for a card to go from there to there. And that's the number that you use for your customers. So they could expect that a feature will be available in 2 weeks' time. And so you can use that number to sort of drive your forecasting. I'll skip fishbowl estimation. There's some other things that you can measure. I mean, it's not just planning that makes teams successful. You know, you can talk about, you know, rating yourselves on how are we at testing, how are we at refactoring. You can kind of look at those sorts of things. You can do a retrospective, what worked well, what didn't work so well. You can kind of draw, you know, how do you feel about the project? You know, this person thought it was like a web, this person thought it was a rocket ship blasting off. Often you see people with, you know, roller coasters or, you know, rocks falling on heads, that kind of thing. It's a little bit scary sometimes. So basically, you know, don't be afraid of lightweight planning. I think this iterative process, measuring a velocity, or if you're going to try Kanban, measuring a cycle time, you actually get some very interesting numbers that you can project and draw those diagrams from. And so you can actually really kind of forecast how the project's going to go. And it really, you know, those planning boards where you're actually moving things across, those really make planning honest and very real. So you've got very up-to-date numbers and you really have a feel for where the project is. And you focus on finishing things and getting them out. That's all I have to say, so thank you very much. Do I have time for some questions, or there's a question at the back? Yes.
I wanted your opinion on the Robin style, Heat style approach, which frankly returns I would characterize as saying that your ethics are modeled in Smalltalk, and your story cards that you see either just part of that model or perhaps in the test cases for training. So you have Smalltalk right from the word go, you never share cards, you integrate whiteboard or these they're a lot less important than the Smalltalk model we actually build with.
Okay, so the question as I understood it, I'll just repeat it for people, was what if the epics that I described, you actually modeled them in Smalltalk, so they were kind of like, you know, prototype models or something, and so you never really generated the story cards.
Well, actually, I was specifically thinking of the approach used by, say, Robin or PRP, which I think is along those lines.
My only concern with that is I find it very useful to have teams. And this is if you're co-located, standing in front of a board. Now, if you're not co-located, what is the equivalent of standing around the board? And what are the artifacts that you are saying how well they are done? So, you know, I guess if you can get that from a Smalltalk model, I don't know. There's something about the paper cards that is very visual and very, very useful. So I guess I would be tempted to still create the cards and then write models around the cards, actually, but it's not something I've heard of, so I'd be interested to investigate.
Continue offline, perhaps.
Oh, questions back there?
From my experience trying to manage projects, I found that I've not found a software that replaces paper. And do you think that we kind of have the risk of trying to use software actually takes up more time than if we just do the low-tech solution for it?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with the low-tech thing. I mean, I've shown the tool that I've used is like very lightweight, but inevitably I use paper cards and put paper cards on the board. You can really get sucked into tools and they take a lot of time, and I'm not sure that they keep things honest. It's, you know, when we're working on technical problems, you're right, we get, oh, how do I improve that diagram? How do I change it? So it is something to be aware of. Yeah.
How do you map this to a team that isn't co-located?
So you might need a little bit of tooling there, a little bit of something to record. I mean, one of the things that I do, I'll just quickly show you here. My computer's going to cooperate. Oh, sorry, hang on a second. So it's something like a tool like this, where that board that I showed you, you can can see here, you can put this in a tool, so you get people's, that one's almost done, and then on the 14th it was completed. So that's the equivalent of a planning board down here. And so that's what produces this graph. But equally, you could just take a picture of a board. You know, someone could have a board with a webcam, and as people finish stuff, you could like sort of strike it off. There are some tools that actually do this. Some of them tend to go a little bit off the rails, and they get really complicated and start doing things, and then you're getting into what Jan was talking about. So something nice and simple. You just want to see, you know, you're kind of thinking about how much have I got done so far? What's my current velocity? Is like, you know, and trying to focus on completion of things. So tools that help with that, and there are some, they do work well. You know, even a wiki could work. You know, you could just all update a wiki and just sort of say, you know, this card is half done or almost done, or you know, what you really want is it's complete. I think I'm probably out of time, so if you want to grab me in the halls afterwards, you can ask me about any of the other Agile stuff. I know it's not the most interesting thing, but hopefully it's kind of one of those things that you can use, and you know, maybe it'll help, you know, work on some of the projects, or if you end up working on another team, these are some of the techniques that you could perhaps pull out of the, you know, the bag and apply to teams that you might work with. So, thanks.